Public Enterprises Act of 1993 to sell all government SOEs in Nigeria. And so, as a corollary to that, there is no policy of reform or restructuring of SOEs in Nigeria. In my presentation later today, I will share on the historical trajectory of state-owned enterprises in Africa, what needs to be done to bring about a resurgence. But to end, I want to say that there are clear lessons that we need to learn from this conference as the way forward. The first is that it is quite clear that what a government does is dependent on the ideological orientation and the commitment of the state. There is therefore a need for a platform to disseminate the lessons of SOEs across the world from what we'll be sharing this morning. And then secondly, I think there should be a strategy emanating from this conference for sharing of the success stories of Kerala and other countries across the world. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Igbuzor. And I think now we can move to Mr. Radhakrishnan, Chairman Porters.
I'd be talking to you more from the side of a practitioner, having had about 5.5 years as Secretary for Industries in the Government of Kerala, and over 20 years as Managing Director and CEO of various public sector institutions. So a lot of my talk would be based on practical outlooks, tempered with a critique of what has been said by various academic studies and practitioners here. As Dr. Reddy has said, there has been always swings between the private sector and nationalization. If you look at the history of mankind, there are times of market failure when nationalization takes place, and people think that that is the best way forward. After some time, public enterprises are not performing good enough, so there is a wave of privatization. Again, it goes back. So it's a cyclical phenomenon, basically. And what is fashionable at a particular time is always followed. Some countries follow it later, some do it earlier. And if you see that in the early 90s, privatization was seen as the panacea for all SOE problems. And I've heard when I was working in the European Economic Union, or EU now, in 92, I've heard an expert say that the only acceptable SOE is a liquidated one. I've actually heard it. So from these kind of extreme views, there are swings either ways. Certain sectors really need public enterprises. And there are economies of scale by bundling of state enterprises, as Dr. Reddy has indicated. And state capitalism in China is a hugely successful one right now. But we don't know where it is going to go. All this indicates that we have to innovate constantly and come up with new solutions to problems as and when they arise. There is also this huge issue of relationship between the state and state-owned enterprises. You know, the owner versus the professional manager issue here. I think it was Mr. Alec Altonen who mentioned that the state has to be an informed and active owner. This is a very, very critical thing which he has said, in my opinion. And right now, deliberately, I see in the government of India at least, a lot of companies being created with less than 50% equity of the government, so that they don't attract Section 617 of the Companies Act and become a government company. So the government itself is acknowledging that being a public enterprise is not always a good thing. It has certain costs, particularly in particular sectors. If you look at the annual general meetings of state-owned enterprises, I've attended many of them, they're basically a ritual without meaning. Whereas if you go to the private sector, that's when the shareholders actually question the management on how they have been performing and how they have not performed. But can AGMs be taken in public enterprises with all departments, including finance, to evaluate management performance and leading to suggestions on whether this management should continue? Which are the key sectors, which are the heads of departments, which are the CEOs who have not been performing, and see that they are changed, rather than following the whims and fancies of the political leadership. I think Dr. Mohammed particularly said that there is a conflict between national policy, shareholder interest, which is basically profitability, and the social objectives. This is very true of public enterprises, which have a problem in deciding what exactly their objectives are. And I think it was Mr. Dag Dieter who mentioned that running in 2 or 3 directions at the same time is an impossible thing. This is some of the things which we had to do as CEOs of public enterprises. If you see what has been done in Sweden, as has been indicated by Mr. Dieter, they have taken certain steps to ensure that PSUs become profitable. What I find personally is that good enterprises, whether they be in the public sector or in the private sector, they have a lot of things in common, which means that the managerial environment is what contributes to performance of the enterprise. And if you look at the problems and the current approaches to the policy as regards public enterprises, you find that there is a lack of understanding as to the differentiation between public and private enterprise. There is no differentiation between public enterprises itself. For example, many states do not differentiate between a very large enterprise or a very small enterprise. The finance department comes up with a direction which is applicable to the smallest enterprise as well as the most profitable larger enterprise, which needs a lot more autonomy and trust to perform well. Lack of autonomy in decision taking is really affecting the decision taking powers of the CEOs and the SOE management, who are usually in the clutches of excessive bureaucratic control. Now, one way the central government has adopted is to have MOUs for the so-called Navratna, or the highly performing enterprises, and give them a lot more freedom. But what has happened is that the CEOs in many state-owned enterprises do not have the capacity, the same kind of capacity to run the enterprises, because remuneration is low. We are not able to attract the best talent, and then because of that, the bureaucracy comes and tries to have excessive control. This is a vicious cycle which we must come out of by adequate compensation to the top management and the CEOs of state enterprises. Now, state-owned enterprises are not all corporatized. Till recently we had the electricity board. This state particularly has the electricity board still, which is neither a statutory body, neither is it a corporate body. If I ask what exactly it is, it's neither a bird nor a beast. It's something in between. It's owned directly by the government, but it doesn't have a corporate existence. Corporatization is found to be one of the areas where the efficiency is supposed to improve. I'm not very sure about it, but certainly corporatization is a solution, provided political interference in commercial decisions doesn't happen, and IR issues, including the strength of unions, is not one of the factors which decides what decisions the management takes. Generally, in state-owned enterprises, there is a huge agency problem, in my opinion, because, as has been remarked by one of the speakers earlier, there is a certain conflict of interest between success in the election and SOE performance. Often there has to be decisions which are very strong, which may not be accepted by a large number of people, but then they are necessary. If the bitter medicine is not taken at one particular point, the sickness increases and increases beyond a particular point where you cannot do anything about it, and liquidation will be the only way out. So this agency problem of the political executive, which is having control over public enterprises, is dealt with in various ways by having SPVs or by having holding companies and so on, in various models have been presented before us. But whatever be the model adopted, I think that the appointments of the management, the CEOs with the tenure and clear accountability is certainly one of the things which has to be looked at. Because just being a CEO of a public enterprise or an SOE at the pleasure of the political executive is not a good enough solution. I think SOEs will deteriorate as long as that position continues. Another point I want to flag is the counterproductive audit procedures in Indian SOEs. Particularly in our state, we have seen a lot of business activity, which is a risk-taking activity, which is curbed by the fear of audit. The use of audit should not be such that the management doesn't have the right to make any mistakes. If you take 10 decisions and one happens to be wrong, it is not for the audit to come up and say you should have done it in hindsight, because one acts with whatever information is available. And this is a very important difference between public and private enterprises. In private enterprises, you don't have witch hunting in the form of one mistake committed by the top management, whereas this is the problem in public sector. So less risk and leads to a lack of initiative and passing on of all risks to contractors, for example. And basic principle in management is that whichever is the agency which can mitigate a risk should take that risk. And that is violated left and right in all public enterprises, because we want to, as part of the management, pass on all the risk to the other side, whether it be procurement of goods or services, or if you want to create a project, if you want to select a partner in investment, whatever be the case, you have a system where risk cannot be taken by the government side. This creates problems. There is a lack of clarity, as has been indicated earlier. I remember when I was a student in IIM Bangalore, there was a study which was done on the perceptions of objectives of the public enterprises by different people, including the CEO, the top management, middle management, unions, workers, government representatives, and civil society, public, the media, everybody. And there was a marked difference in the perception of objectives. Unless we are certainly clear about what public enterprises are about, I don't think that they can continue to exist and satisfy all stakeholders, particularly the stakeholders I mentioned right now. Employment as an objective is often contradictory to profit as an objective. At the same time, you have to be profitable and provide employment. You cannot reduce. These are some of the constraints under which the private sector does not work, but the public sector does. Corporate governance are totally different styles in private and SOE management. To face competitions, different strategies should be made, and some of those strategies have to be confidential. We have need for transparency, but accountability to the public sometimes has a conflict with business objectives. The RTI Act, for example, Right to Information Act, is sometimes grossly misused against state-owned enterprises, leading to commercial decisions being announced to competitors, and there is no level playing field because the private sector is not obliged to do that. Directors in public and private enterprises are totally different quality. I have had the fortune or misfortune of being a director in many well-run as well as badly run private enterprises, and I find the quality of decision-taking is different. The sort of matters which the board goes into are totally different, and the whole orientation of the public sector board is to ensure that the chief executive doesn't get into a trouble, so he takes it to the board, or he doesn't have adequate delegation, so he takes it to the board. There is no common decision taking at the board level, which is not the case in the private sector. In the private sector, there is certain expertise which is used to jointly resolve certain problems that the management has to face and take strategic decisions which will be useful in the long run. The procurement policy is totally wrong in the private enterprises. Many public enterprises, for example, they are able to stick to a good manufacturer of original equipment because they can reduce on the inventory costs, they can ensure that the quality is high and so on. But since public enterprises have to buy the lowest, you buy maybe 10 or 20 different types of equipment from different companies, and you carry a huge inventory, and you have problems also in terms of evaluating the bidders and giving weightage for their good performance earlier. So the worst producers come to the private sector to sell their goods and services, and we are obliged to buy them. This is an unpleasant fact which we have to work around. So SIUs are working in a very challenging environment. And even though they are now open to competition, they say there is a level playing field. It's not at all level, as it be clear from you, for you from what I have mentioned. access to technology, access to capital, capacity of management, as I indicated earlier, human resources, in all these we are lacking as SOEs as compared to the private sector. The private sector has no problem accessing capital, whereas capital cannot be accessed from the market even with a very viable project of the state-owned enterprise because of governmental controls, given the cumbersome procedures involved and so on. And the level playing field is again not seen when it comes to the remuneration and the hire and fire policies which are there in the private sector. I'll conclude by saying that public-private partnership is one solution which can be used in state-owned enterprises, at least in the field of infrastructure and in the form, in certain projects, expansion projects, for example, of certain enterprises. And as Chairman and CEO of the largest port in India, Jawaharlal Nehru Port Trust, this is a case of this port having used public-private partnerships to enhance its productivity and retain its position with 60% of the market share of entire export and imports in India. What has been done is that there are certain terminals which are owned by the private sector, and there is a healthy competition between the terminal run by the port itself and the private sector. And the productivity is constantly being compared, the equipment is constantly being compared, the technology is constantly being compared, and so we are able to perform much better. So public-private partnership is probably one of the ways out forward for SOE management. These are some of the thoughts which came to mind. I thank the Department of Industries for having given me an opportunity to share some of my thoughts, and I hope that this thinking will also lead to some policy change, because otherwise we've been hearing these kind of policy suggestions for a long time, but everything is the same. When 20 or 30 years back, I've heard these kind of things, but things are the same. Unless we are committed to reform and to change policy so that we can genuinely help some state-owned enterprises, I think there will be no comparison between the state and the private enterprises. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Radhakrishnan. I think we'll move to Mr. Chandra Pillai. Mr. Pillai, please.
Speakers before me already narrated varied experiences globe over, and that much to this session, that contribution is very valuable, I think. Before coming to the basic point of our discussion, last 2 decades policy developments in state-owned enterprises. With gratitude, I recollect the session of the morning today, which was very much enlightening, especially the contribution by Prabhat Patnaik and Dr. Sundaram, which gave actually the real premise of the philosophical and theoretical aspects of the significance and importance of public sector in our social development. While coming to the policy shifts, changes, and the sequences of the recent 2 decades, it is not easy to meticulously go into the historical chronological order total. Broadly, I want to go initially the global situation. We know the recent G20 Seoul concluded unsuccessfully without any possibility to identify a real equilibrium between deficit and expenditure. That shows the systemic failure or lacuna, how the capitalism is now demonstrating in almost all economies. One thing is very, very obvious. The preachers of capitalism themselves recently shifted drastically and now working their plans focusing on the responsibility and the role of government to intervene to keep a control in the financial sector and the economy in total. That is a basic issue where we have to look while evolving policies for on and our own country too. In India, my major mission is to focus in India's experience in the recent past. Up to 1990, the cutoff year which is given in the session's discussion, is very important. Bureaucratically led, government dependence oriented public sector experience was there in India with its plus and minuses. A coinciding international development of the setback of the systemic East Europe and USSR systems, governments. To my view, the aggressive financial capital progressively but successfully made inroads into every economy and to governments and even to the natural resources world over. The so-called and celebrity new economic policy is that where they supported overwhelmingly the private sector and started withdrawing the government responsibilities from all areas. I'm not narrating it in a detailed way. It is not possible because of the time paucity. But private sector was not that enthusiastic to invest in the sectors where it is not easy to get returns, the gestation period questions. In India, in the second stage, in late 90s, government changed its strategy to hand over the public sector units through disinvestment, share sales, sale as such, through various processes. Paradeep Phosphates, to mention a company, Modern Bread, a second one, VSNL, such all companies effectively handed over to private sector people. But all along, over that period, proudly I can say the left platform, the political conscience of left of India, vehemently opposed and tried to educate the masses the catastrophic effect of this kind of an activity by the government and its casualties. One thing is now clear. After the financial crisis international and the real economy recession, Manmohan Singh himself claimed that India was not that way, went into the turbulence of this financial problem because India insulated. Basically, the public sector financial institutions saved India. The credit actually goes to the left. In that major policy question, inside the parliament and outside, we very effectively tried to stall the government from its onward march of this negativity. UPA 1 was dependent on the left. We very, very correctly and with a very determined way, with a political oomph, stalled that process. That only saved this country. And now Manmohan Singh taking the credit, it actually goes to the left. And after that, from the international developments, Manmohan Singh government is not taking any lesson genuine. Still they are with the mission to privatize the public sector companies, including the financial sector. Navaratna. So-called Navaratna is an Indian term used by Indian government for their purposes and convenience. Here also, to change this policy of an anti-national nature, we are now trying to mobilize